when I think of Sheldon, I think of Socrates. He'll be flattered, I think, because I think he has Socrates in high esteem.
I look like Socrates.
Right. And what I think of Socrates getting up in the morning by the riverside, running his fingers through his hair, throwing on that party toga, and walking into the first person he can encounter and asking that question. The question is going to disturb that person for weeks. Sheldon is the professor of psychology and the Courtney and Stephen Ross Professor of Interdisciplinary Studies at Skidmore College.
How's this? Is this okay? I just feel distant, but behind the podium. Good to see many of you. You all look vaguely familiar at this point, but I know I've seen a lot of you all in the past, and I'm sorry I didn't get to be here last evening, so I feel semi-awkward that my comments may be a bit out of context and run the risk of being a bit redundant. Be that as it may, I'm here as a second-rate pale shadow of a substitute for Janice Dickinson, who was unable to be here with us today. In a perfect universe, we would have heard from Janice talking about a very fine paper that she wrote. It came out last year, Neil, is that right? 2009, called The People Paradox. And Janice is an evolutionary biologist, I want to say ornithologist, or those are the people that study birds. I always confuse that with entomologist. She's an ologist of some sort who studies birds at Cornell. And Janice is a woman of many talents. She's a world-renowned studier of birds. She's a biologist at Cornell. And through Ron Leifer, a friend of Ernest Becker, she's intimately acquainted with both Becker's ideas and the empirical work that I do with my colleagues that operates under the rubric of terror management theory. And what Janice did in the People Paradox paper was to take Becker's ideas and the research that we've done over the years to test hypotheses derived from those ideas and to apply them to understanding people's resistance to doing the right thing with respect to coming to terms with and acting constructively on problems that pertain to environmental degradation. And my goal today is a very modest one, and that's just to tell you what's in Janice's paper in the hopes that that will be a useful cattle prod, intellectual cattle prod of sorts that will get us going, because I think the main part of today, and it's an exciting one, is just the dynamic interaction that we've got planned amongst us. And so with that in mind, Ernest Becker, 30-second classic comic book overview, because I think most folks here are very much aware of the nature of Becker's enterprise. He was, as you know, singularly devoted to the development of an overarching theoretical framework to help discover the motivational underpinnings of human behavior. He was not an unambitious man. He just said, I think somebody should pay attention to really big frameworks. And so you got, Newton and Einstein did a pretty good job trying to make sense of the physical universe. And you had Darwin, pretty smart guy, talks about biology in a few simple terms. And Becker, I think, tried to do the same thing with regard to human behavior. And he poses a very simple question. Why do people do what they do when they do it? And he says, okay, if we're going to answer that question, as Henry has already ably alluded to, we first of all need to be patently interdisciplinary. We need to think broadly. We need to consider ideas from all disciplines. We need to do so with great care and respect. On the other hand, all ideas are not created equal. People have the right to express their opinions, and the way that I like to say it, just to be annoying, is that you have the right to be wrong. So on the one hand, everyone's opinion matters, and but not all ideas are equally good. And so Becker was committed to empirical confirmation, not because science is logically capable of attaining the truth, but rather because it's ruthlessly effective at identifying and discarding the untrue. And then he was a big fan of the Enlightenment and of the 60s kind of optimism that we could use our understanding of the human condition and human nature, ideally to make the world and ourselves better places. And I hope we at least have some vestige of commitment to that notion. Otherwise, we should just start the drinking part of the day now. And then finally, Becker said, I think it would behoove us to be sure that we anchor our ideas about human behavior in the context of Darwin's theories about evolution. And you know this, but just very quickly, Becker's ideas, I think, are disarmingly simple, and that's what makes them so patently profound. He just starts with the assumption that people, like all other forms of life, are biologically predisposed to stay alive in order to survive and reproduce. And then he says, yeah, but there's a lot of ways following Darwin to stay alive and reproduce. And people are somewhat unique in that we're both social creatures and we're highly intelligent creatures, noting that neither of those attributes are in any way unique, but it's a rare combination of both being highly gregarious and fantastically intelligent, to the point where I like Otto Ronk's way of putting it when he says only humans make the unreal real. We're the only creatures that can imagine something that doesn't yet exist and have the audacity to transform that into reality. But that's very exciting. But as Kierkegaard noted, it's also interesting to be that smart, because in Kierkegaard's way of thinking about things, we're so smart that we actually come to recognize that we exist, which is both exhilarating and terrifying. So it's exhilarating to be alive and to know it. But it's also terrifying, as you know, to realize that, like all finite creatures, your days are numbered, that you could die at any time for reasons that you could never anticipate or control, and that from a purely biological point of view, you are no more significant or enduring than a cockroach or a cucumber. And for Becker, all of those realizations conspire to render human beings literally debilitated with abject terror. And Becker hypothesizes that in order to mitigate the anxiety engendered by the uniquely human awareness of death, that people quite unconsciously, but nevertheless very cleverly, developed what the anthropologists today call culture, humanly constructed beliefs about reality that we share with other folks in a group to reduce death anxiety by giving us a sense that we're persons of value in a world of meaning. And one aspect of this idea of meaning is that all cultures give us a sense, or rather, all cultures give us an explanation of how the universe was created, give us a prescription for appropriate conduct, and some promises of immortality, either literal immortality, like the heavens and the afterlives and reincarnations of all the world's great religions, or symbolic immortality. Robert J. Lifton talks about this notion extensively, but it goes back to Plato, the idea that you may not be here forever, but you're comforted by the prospect that a tangible manifestation of your existence will persist nonetheless. That's why we like to build pyramids and have kids, write great novels, amass great fortunes. And so that's basically Becker in a nutshell. Where we come in, this being my buddies Jeff Greenberg and Tom Pazinski and I 30 years ago, when we ran into Becker's ideas for the first time, we just thought this was the best stuff ever. And I started ambling around North America and Europe, even Asia, when they let me in. And I started saying, oh, these are just great ideas. You all should listen to these ideas. And it went over like a giant turd in academic psychology punch bowl. I could clear a room of hundreds of scholars in seconds by just saying words like existential, big theory, humans. I can't even remember the words that would just aggravate people. And they were like, this is bullshit, frankly. There's no evidence. And so what we've done for the past 30 years, and some of you have heard me pontificate about this in the past, is to just design studies that we think provide, from a traditional scientific point of view, very strong evidence for Becker's central tenets. And the one paradigm that many of you are familiar with, but that I need to make explicit for today to be rendered sensible, is what we call the mortality salience paradigm. Basically, if Becker's ideas are correct, if your beliefs about reality serve a death-denying function, then back in the day, our big idea that we had one day was, okay, what would happen if we had some people think about themselves dying and other people think about something unpleasant but not fatal, having a limb cut off, being in a car accident and becoming a paraplegic, having a root canal without anesthetic, giving a talk in public and puking on a table, all unpleasant but not fatal things. And then a little bit while later, just to measure something, usually beliefs that are culturally constructed. And our hypothesis very simply is, if your beliefs about reality serve a death-denying function, then when you ponder your own mortality, that should increase the psychological need for those beliefs, and we should be able to detect that by more positive reactions to other people who share those beliefs and more negative reactions to people who oppose them or are merely different from them. So there are now literally hundreds of studies that provide confirmation of this notion that subtle reminders of death have consequential effects, not only on attitudes, but also on behavior. All right, so now let's get to the matters at hand. Janice, in her paper, The People Paradox, as I've already mentioned, her goal was to take what I've just told you and to apply it to environmental concerns. And in particular, why is it so difficult to get people to even agree that there are said concerns? And here's what I believe to be the, what do they call it, the topic sentence of this paper. And remember, the title being The People Paradox. Janice says, the very things that bring us immortality often conflict with our prospect for survival. And therein lies the paradox. The very things that we strive for in order to render ourselves immortal have the unintended consequence of killing us. That would be funny if it weren't literally true. All right, so, and that's what the paper is designed to articulate, and basically it's a good paper, and I recommend that everybody read it, but in terms of the way the paper's structured, what Janice goes on to say is, look, I think there's two major concepts that we need to explore. One is how striving for immortality results in a denigration of nature, and the other is how striving for immortality results in a kind of conspicuous consumption that has the unintended consequence of denigrating nature. So she basically, well, another way to think about this is that there's a direct effect on our relationship with nature, and then there's an indirect effect mediated by the American national pastime, shopping. And what Janice then goes on to do is to discuss each of those notions in turn, and so that's what I'll do. So let's just talk about how immortality striving can undermine our relationship with nature or result in behaviors that incline us to denigrate nature. All right, here we can talk about this in terms of both literal and symbolic immortality, or I don't know, maybe it's actually not clear to me that that distinction may be blurred. Be that as it may,